Well, thank you, Hein, for your kind words. It's a great honor for me to be able to share my thoughts with you on migration systems and social inequalities, opening the black box with social mechanisms. Eva Moraska just pointed out that this title is completely different from the one announced, and I gladly confess that it is so. Yet, shortly before the conference, I realized that Oliver and I are disagreeing on fundamental issues concerning migration systems, so I wanted to use my time here to point them out. And I think in a nutshell, I think Oliver will argue really for reinvigorating migration systems theory and re-injecting agency into it. And my argument here, which I want to develop before he takes over the stage to convince you, is to cast a bit of doubt from my point of view, arguing basically that we should keep systems theories and agency theories apart, use them both, and that would be the first point. And the second point, to advance a bit, not beyond the theories, but in a very modest way, to use social mechanisms on an individual, collective, and a systemic level to shed light at certain issues connected to international migration. So that, in a nutshell, is the argument I would like to make. Now, I think that migration systems theory has been a really very beneficial point of departure as a holistic approach to start international migration. It includes regions of origin and destination and looks at the manifold processes. It provides a real macrostructure for migratory processes. It is nonetheless different a lot of times from other theories, from other systems theories, such as world systems theory, where you only have macrostructural determinants, such as the position of a country in the world system, the economic and political system, which are driving migration. So migration systems theory, as it was developed in the 1980s and 90s, is much more open, so to speak, and not as deterministic, I think, as world systems theory. And I think one of the greatest qualities of migration systems theory is that it sparked off a very vivid, vigorous, and very fruitful line of research looking at the endogenous quality of international migration, starting with the observation of chain migration, bringing in the role of networks and social capital, and not being only concerned with exogenous drivers such as crisis or what was called underdevelopment. So far, so good. Now, where do my doubts start? With reinvigorating it in a wholesale way. I think when you look at it, at systems theory in a broader way, you could look at two ways of doing systems theory. That's the old Parsonian way, where you look at parts form element of a whole. That's where in migration systems, for example, you look at migration policies of immigration countries, exit policies, you look at the migration industry, you look at migrant networks, you look at hometown associations, you look at various elements of the migration system. And in a way, the Parsonian way of approaching it is to say, well, it sees society, perhaps even world society, as a kind of a cohesive social unit. And it was criticized for that, as you remember. And here, later, one of the persons coming along was Mr. Luhmann, who was one of the biggest names in neo-functionalist systems theory. And he said, well, baloney, right? Societies are not integrated through values. They're integrated through communication. It's the sequence of communication. You find one act of communication after the other. Or if you don't like Luhmann, you could turn to Wittgenstein, who says the same thing. Basically, that in order to proceed, in order to get ahead, you need to know how to proceed with communication. And these systems theories, in a way, and that's why I'm so critical with reviving them, and that's why I think Oliver is so hopeful in reviving them. There is, in these systems theories, how does change come about? Luhmann does not need agency, right? I mean, change is evolution, and evolution is chance. I mean, I'm simplifying, grossly simplifying here. And in this kind of theoretical approach, social life operates according to codes. Like you have systems, politics, the polity, the economy, culture, religion, you name it, several systems, and each of these systems is determined by a code. Like politics, you have power or no power. The economy, you can pay or cannot pay. Science, which would be nice, truth or no truth. Or culture, us or them, so to speak, right? Now, I find it hard to think along those lines, because would migration be really a system? And what would be this binary code, if you use Luhmann for a moment, if I can ask you to do that? Then what would it be? I could only come up, maybe you have better ideas, and you know, then I'm glad to be convinced. But in Luhmann, you could say move or not to move. But that only pertains to the causes of migration, right? Move or not to move. There is no binary code you could use. That's why I'm a bit skeptical about reviving it. So I would say migration in this systems theory way of thinking is not a system. You would then need to go back to good old Parsons and buy into all the problems he had to face. Now, but I do think that systems theory is able to deliver very thick descriptions, very good descriptions, and I'm sure that will also come out during this conference, among other things, of how individual systems operate. Take the cultural systems in international migration, the distinction between we and the other, the distinction made by citizenship policies, the distinction made by populist politics. So I do think that there is a role for systems theory. But nonetheless, I think that migration systems theory and agency approaches should be kept separate. They should be used on different levels, but not fused into one theory. I mean, not to revive the old structure agency myth, that it's possible to integrate one big coherent theory. Instead, I think, I mean, this is very modest. For 10 or 20 years in the social sciences, we've been talking a lot about social mechanisms. And I do think, before I turn to them, I do think that we need concepts, not perhaps big theoretical concepts, but mid-range theoretical concepts, which will allow us to talk both on the agency and the systems level, which is not, in a way, averse to systems theory, but simply says, well, you know, systems theory has a place, but a very specific place. Now, what are social mechanisms with which I think we should pry open the black box of international migration? And I will later on give some examples of social mechanisms looking at international migration in Europe. But quite abstractly, they bridge, I think, between theoretical abstractions and empirical findings. And mechanisms you find in processes, or they are processes, which really, where you find patterned, regular interactions between an initial condition and an outcome, right? For example, an initial condition, which is pioneer migration. You have an outcome, which is the concentration of migrants or other mobile persons in a certain destination. And one of the mechanisms, obviously, would be brokerage, right? I mean, that's the kind of idea behind it. And these mechanisms operate on all levels, I think, individual, collective, systemic. The brokerage mechanism operates mostly on the individual and collective level. So identify concrete mechanisms, bundle them in general mechanisms, and I will give some examples on that. Now, I do think mechanisms are mid-range concepts, and when you study international migration, I mean, we hear a lot about, and Oliver already mentioned that in his description of the Themis project, that you have processes, let's say, of cumulative causation, and as I learned recently, of diminutive causation, which you come up with in the Themis project. And I do think these are very broad, general mechanisms, right? And you need to break them down, like what I meant by brokerage. Georg Simmel's Tertius Daudens, the third who laughs, is that person to be trusted really? Brokers are not necessarily be trusted. So it's a real effort also to kind of de-romanticize perhaps also the role of pioneer migrants. Or as an economic sociologist put it, Ronald Byrd, brokers bridge structural holes, connect people who have not been connected hitherto. Okay. Now, on a systems level, think of citizenship as a social mechanism. According to Rogers Brubaker, one of the prime kind of mechanisms of social closure, which is very important, determining life chances. So in a way, I think a very modest ambition would be to arrive at a kind of a taxonomy of social mechanisms in international migration. Now, I'm not going to arrive at that today. I will not try that, don't worry. But that would be kind of a long-term goal. Now, I think that the concern with causes of migration, with dynamics of migration is all well. But I think that what I want to bring in here are substantive concerns. Substantive concerns, not just with the dynamics or the causes, but substantive concerns with what could be called inequalities. After all, migration is a strategy to improve life chances, to improve one's social position. And there is, as we know, there is a nexus, at least in the hopes of those who migrate, who move geographically, to improve through geographical mobility, to achieve social mobility, to advance, to have a better life for the children themselves. And these all involve inequalities of resources, material resources, inequalities of status and power, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. So I think I'm questioning whether or not it is useful to study migration systems in an abstract way, devoid of inequalities. I don't want to go back to world systems theory where there is a large part of determinism, but I wonder, what are the questions we are really interested in which are at stake? I mean, for me, wearing the hat today of a sociologist, you're not surprised to find that it's social inequalities. Now, and in these inequalities, I think, are not just inequalities which are fleeting and passing, but what Charles Tilly called durable inequality, or what Douglas Massey called categorical inequalities. That certain categories, be they gender or class or religion or sexual orientation or legal status, there are many other heterogeneities, differences between groups, not between individuals, between groups, are boundaries. And how are these boundaries in the migration process created? Is it really the case? I mean, that's my question, it's my current research. Is it really the case that through international migration you find that these categories are loosened? Or it could also be that these categories are strengthened. So what about the inequalities? How are the inequalities between groups are changing in migration processes? And I think what's helpful is, first of all, to before I come to to give some empirical examples, is to distinguish a couple of social mechanisms. I mean, there could be discursive mechanisms which or perhaps I shouldn't say discursive, but mechanisms which you find in public debates. And there are mechanisms which you would find, for example, social structurally, like mechanisms you find in public debates or in debates are stereotyping, framing other people, and social structural mechanisms would be such as social closure through citizenship, which I mentioned. Now, in what's going to come, I will use examples of social mechanisms and refer in my use of these examples to migration in Europe, let's say from what could be called the European periphery, Eastern Europe, to the European Union. I mean, that's the kind of the frame of reference from what I'm going to talk about. Okay, now these are simply some examples. You see the columns. They're individual and collective mechanisms, and they're systemic and societal mechanisms. I mean, that's in the vertical, right? And I then look at these levels through the lens of general social mechanisms. The general social mechanisms are categorization, exclusion, hierarchization, opportunity hoarding, exploitation. Now, this is no exhaustive list. I simply drew them from, good old Marx, Weber, Tilly, and so on, or Terborn. You recognize them. But then I think the real work is to identify the concrete mechanisms. How is it work? How do these mechanisms work? To give you one example, when you look at, since we're talking about migration systems, if you look in terms of the discursive categorizations, how are people categorized? When you look at the systemic level, one important mechanism is framing. Not all people who cross borders are considered migrants. That's very simple, but I think it's very important. For example, last year we did a study of German newspapers reporting on people crossing borders. And we looked at the time frame from 1990 to 2010. And what we found is that when these reports, these were major newspapers, both with an intellectually higher ambition, such as die Zeit or die Süddeutsche, but also tabloids. But what you find when you analyze, what we found when we analyzed these newspapers over a 20-year period was that whenever there was talk of what's sometimes called the highly skilled, the word migrant was not mentioned. Right? The word migrant or refugee, that was another category, and you could, in a way, you don't need much imagination to see that people crossing borders are categorized and hierarchically categorized. Because what we also found that in the newspaper reports usually, you find that, and we were interested in transnational ties migrants entertain across borders. What you find is that these transnational ties among the highly skilled were what, although the Global Commission report of 2005, they were the win-win-win situation. Everybody wins. Country of origin, country of destination, migrants win. Whereas transnational ties in the case of what is called labor migrants, refugees, is another category on that side. It is leading to social disintegration. It is connected to terrorism. It's connected to civil war. Now, I admit this is very simplistic. But that is the picture we got from a very simple analysis. And I think this type of framing is not only done in newspapers, of course, as we heard Ian Golin talk, this is also done by us and by our colleagues. We are part, so to speak, of framing the issues. Now, exclusion, obviously, is a very important factor and mechanism. As I said, citizenship policies is very important. If you look at Europe, it does make a difference whether or not you are obviously a citizen of a member country or not. I think there's a study by Piperno a couple of years ago. She looked at the migration of women care workers from Romania and Ukraine to Italy. And what she found was that those women from Romania were, of course, needless to say, better able to bring their children to Italy, whereas nonetheless, it was easier, but nonetheless, the surprising finding was, and that's why one should not overdo the importance, or that's why we should qualify the importance of legal status, that the women she looked at from the Ukraine were also crossing borders quite often, although they were not as privileged as the women from Romania. And I do think that that is very important to look at, because legal status is not, of course, the only kind of predictor of exclusion or hierarchization or exploitation. For example, when you look at another very highly gendered market in which you find many immigrants in Europe, the construction sector, mostly men, in this case, you find, in a way, exclusion exploitation. Exploitation here defined that, you don't give someone his or her due share of the work she's doing. What you find, for example, in construction work is that those workers, not only extracomunitari, from outside Europe, but also workers who cross borders, let's say, who move from Poland to Germany or the UK to do work in the construction sector, when they are categorized as self-employed, they're devoid of social insurance, although de facto, they're dependent workers. Very good. So this, I think, is very important, not simply to look at the legal distinctions to arrive at certain forms of mechanisms which produce inequality, but also to look at the very fine-grained, so to speak, pattern of employment relationships, where you could say that in terms of exploitation, especially now with the economic crisis in Southern Europe, you do have not only extracomunitari, but also citizens in the European Union who are affected by exclusion and exploitation. Now, when talking about mechanisms of inequality, what I find interesting is that one could think in a way, and I'm going to talk about that also later on, of mechanisms which create equality, so to speak. And one very interesting mechanism is opportunity hoarding, a mechanism which Charles Tilly wrote a lot about, namely that certain groups get together, let's say in a so-called ethnic enclave or religious enclave, whatever, around which heterogeneity, whatever, form, let's say, business. One of the favorite examples is, to come up with a restaurant chain all over the city, which is governed, so to speak, by a group from a certain village in a certain country, who then bring in others to work for them. On the one hand, this could be considered a mechanism which is creating inequality, so to speak, between groups, between migrant groups. On the other hand, however, it's a mechanism, opportunity hoarding is a mechanism of equality because people improve their social position. So when you look at these mechanisms, what I find very interesting is that it's not necessarily clear-cut what is the outcome or what the outcome is. Now, and I do think that what's very interesting about some of the mechanisms is that they force us to look again at certain patterns of relationships. Let's say within families. When you look at care work, household work, it's an obvious, kind of an obvious case, and the observation has been made that on the one hand, it increases, so to speak, gender equality in the households who can afford household helpers. On the other hand, it injects, so to speak, inequality through the employment of migrant workers who may have, authorization to work or not. And I do think that these mechanisms are so important because also when you look at systemic level, and in the rubric of exploitation, you're forced not only to look at flows in one direction, such as remittances flowing from countries of destination to countries of origin, but to look at all the resources which flow in the opposite direction. So, what is there to say? I think, to sum up, I think that through the use of social mechanism, it is possible to look both at systemic and agency levels, at the individual, at the collective level, but also at the systemic level, without necessarily building an overarching theory. I think one should treat them as complementary approaches. And I do think that a lot of work has to go into specifying the general mechanisms which I mentioned, such as hierarchization, exploitation, opportunity hoarding, discursive categorization. I think that's very important. And we're right now engaged in a study on social protection across borders, and what we find is that if you go beyond all the institutional frameworks of bilateral agreements on the portability of pensions and other kind of legal instruments, what you find that the strategies to improve life chances, yes, even the strategies to improve against social risk through remittances, through care given through family members, may also result in new inequalities within the families, right? For example, a strong gender line, because who is going to do the care work? As I mentioned, the mechanisms producing equality are as important. It's from hierarchization to de-hierarchization, from exploitation to redistribution, but in the not so clear-cut cases such as opportunity hoarding, working both ways. Now, I don't want to predict the future, but I find it interesting that the concern with inequalities, which I put at the forefront of my talk, is in a way very applicable to European integration. Whenever we talk of social Europe, for example, then the observation is made, and we can make the observation, that there is negative market integration, that market integration has been proceeding at a fast rate over the past decades, whereas what's sometimes called positive regulation through social rights is not advancing as fast. And I do think, given the fiscal, the monetary policies of governments in the European Union, this kind of hope for positive integration is further away than ever right at the moment. And I think that some of the mechanisms we find, for example, when I referred to construction work, are basically operating as vividly as ever, so to speak. But we should not, nonetheless, draw the conclusion as if those who suffer from the experience of exploitation are not subjects in their own right. I remember we studied contract workers from Eastern Europe in German construction sites in the 1990s, and we started with the assumption that since they could not bring their families, since they had no independent right to stay, they would be in a very exploited position. Well, the contrary basically was true, because there was a kind of splitting the cake attitude towards their employers. There were kind of collaborative relationships between employers and employees. So I think that I want to warn, so to speak, when I use the word exploitation, this is not to say that there is no agency involved on the part of migrants and others. And to conclude, the very last thought, what I find interesting is, now, when I talk of inequalities, I can put myself in the shoes of a researcher and propagate certain objective standards, like income inequalities, status inequalities, power inequalities, and if I devote a lot of time, I can measure them. But I think what's equally interesting is the subjective perceptions of inequalities on the part of migrants and non-migrants. And what are the standards migrants are comparing themselves with? Is that, so to speak, members of others in the same family, in the same village or town? Are these standards of equality, propagated in the European Union? I mean, the freedom of movement, but also, improving life chances. What are these? Because we cannot, and again, this is a very simple thought, but I think this has not been really taken into account of sufficiently, is that it's only through norms of equality that we can speak of inequality, obviously, right? But then, how widespread are which kinds of norms of equality in the European Union? And what are the standards of comparison? And that's one of the questions I'm struggling with at the moment. So thank you very much for your attention.